The suitcase wheel caught on the marble threshold, and the small jolt was the loudest sound Ada had heard in this house in months. She stood at the front door of the Yoon mansion, with her coat buttoned to her chin and her hand frozen on the cold brass handle, listening. No footsteps. No voice calling her name. Not that anyone in this house had ever called her name like it meant something. Just the low hum of the chandelier above her. The same chandelier that had watched her walk in as a bride a year ago, dressed in white, married to a man who hadn't looked at her once during the entire ceremony. Tonight, she was leaving the same way she'd arrived. Quietly. Alone. If you're watching this, take 30 seconds, wherever you are, and just breathe. Whatever you're walking away from tonight, whatever door you're standing front of, may you have the courage Ada is about to find. Amen. And if this story moves you even a little in the next few minutes, hit that like button and subscribe. Because trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. 1 year earlier, Ada hadn't even known the name Yoon Hae-jun existed. She knew her father's name. She knew the word debt. She knew the sound of men in dark suits standing in their small Lagos living room, speaking in low voices to her father, while her mother gripped Ada's hand so hard it left marks. She knew the moment her father's face changed, from fear to something worse, something like surrender. And she knew the words that came after, words she would never forget no matter how many oceans separated her from that room. There is one way to settle this. My associate's son needs a wife. A foreign wife. No questions asked, ties to local families. Your daughter is suitable, as if she were a piece of furniture being measured for a room. Ada had wanted to scream. She had wanted to grab her father by the collar and ask him how he could even consider it. But she had looked at her mother's face, at the exhaustion carved into it after years of watching her husband's business crumble under debts he never explained, and she understood. This wasn't a question. It was an exit, and she was the door. 3 weeks later, she was on a plane to Busan, South Korea, wearing a wedding dress that didn't fit quite right because there had been no time for proper fittings, carrying a single suitcase that held everything she owned and a small notebook of her grandmother's recipes, the only thing she'd refused to leave behind. The wedding itself lasted 11 minutes. She remembered every second of it, the cold marble floor of the Yoon family estate, the rows of men in black suits who looked at her like she was an item being delivered. And at the front of the room, a man who didn't turn around until the officiant said his name. Yoon Hae-jun. He was younger than she expected, and colder than she'd imagined possible. Tall, sharp-jawed, dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light around him. When he finally turned to face her, his eyes swept over her once. Just once. The way you might glance at a delivery you'd been expecting but had no particular interest in receiving. Then he turned back to face the front, and that was it. No smile, no words, nothing. They exchanged rings. He didn't hold her hand longer than necessary. When the officiant pronounced them married, Hae-jun gave a single, short nod to the officiant, not to her, turned, and walked out of the room, leaving Ada standing there in her ill-fitting dress. A wife to a man who had not spoken a single word to her. That was the last time they were in the same room for nearly 3 weeks. The Yoon mansion was enormous. Wings upon wings of pale stone and glass, gardens manicured with surgical precision. Hallways so quiet Ada sometimes heard her own heartbeat echo off the walls. She had a bedroom in the east wing, beautiful and sterile, like a hotel suite no one had ever truly lived in. Meals were brought to her on trays by staff who wouldn't meet her eyes. When she tried to speak to them, to ask their names, to thank them, they would bow stiffly and leave before she finished her sentence. The only person who spoke to her with anything resembling warmth, in those early weeks, was a young housemaid named Soo-jin, who slipped her an extra blanket one cold night and whispered, "The master doesn't really live here, not really. He just exists here. Don't take it personally, ma'am. He's like this with everyone." But it was personal. It was Ada's whole life now, folded into the silence of a man who had not asked her a single question. Not her name, not her favorite color, not whether she'd left anyone behind. To him she understood slowly. She wasn't a wife. She was a transaction that had been completed. A box that had been checked. The woman who ran the household. A sharp, immaculately dressed woman named Madame Seo, who had served the Yoon family for over 20 years, made Ada's place in the hierarchy very clear within the first week. "You will not interfere with the household," Madame Seo told her, standing in the doorway of Ada's room with her hands folded, her voice polite in the way a closed door is polite. "You will not enter the kitchens. You will not involve yourself in Master Yoon's affairs. Your role here is... I trust you understand." Ada understood perfectly. She was a name on a marriage certificate that solved a problem for 2 families, nothing more. For months, she lived like a ghost in a house full of people. She ate alone. She walked the gardens alone. At night, she would take out her grandmother's notebook, the pages soft and stained from years of use, filled with recipes written in her grandmother's looping handwriting, recipes for jollof rice and pepper soup and fried plantain, recipes that smelled like home even when she only read them. And she would trace the words with her finger, just to remember that somewhere, once, she had belonged to people who loved her. She thought about her parents often. She wondered if her father slept easier now, knowing the debt was paid. She wondered if he ever thought about what it had cost. And every night, she heard the same sound drifting faintly through the mansion's east wing. The low murmur of Haejun's voice on the phone in his study, 2 floors below, talking about shipments and territories and men whose names were spoken like threats. He worked until the early hours of the morning. He barely slept. Sujin told her in hushed tones that the master hadn't had a proper meal in longer than anyone could remember, that he'd send back tray after tray from the kitchen, untouched, and the chefs lived in constant fear of being the next one dismissed. They say he's fired 11 chefs this year, Sujin whispered one evening. Helping Ada fold laundry neither of them needed to fold, just for the company. 11, ma'am. Nobody can cook anything he'll eat. Ada said nothing. But that night, lying awake in her too large bed in her too quiet room, she found herself thinking about her grandmother's kitchen back home. The small, warm room that always smelled like onions and pepper and something simmering. The room where her grandmother used to say, "Food is how we tell people we see them, even when we have no other words." She thought about the silent man 2 floors below her, surrounded by more wealth than she could imagine, eating nothing, seeing no one. And for the first time since she'd arrived in this cold, beautiful house, Ada felt something other than grief. She felt curious. That curiosity didn't leave her. It sat with her through the night, and by the time the pale gray light of early morning crept through her window, it had grown into something close to determination. She waited until she was certain the household was asleep, until the murmur of voices from Jun's study had finally gone quiet, until even Madame Sio's measured footsteps had faded from the halls. Then, wrapping a shawl over her nightclothes, Ada slipped out of her room and made her way down through the silent mansion, following the memory of where she'd seen the kitchens on her first, brief tour, a tour that had ended with Madame Sio's firm instruction never to return there. The main kitchen was dark, vast, and gleaming, rows of steel counters, hanging copper pans that had probably never been touched by Ada's hands, refrigerators humming quietly in the dark. It smelled like nothing. Not bread, not spice, not anything alive. It smelled like a museum. She almost turned back. But then her eyes landed on a smaller door at the far end, half hidden behind a stack of crates, a service pantry, unused, dusty, clearly forgotten by the household staff who had no reason to set foot in it. Inside, she found a small gas burner, a few mismatched pots, and shelves of spices that had clearly been imported and then ignored. Ada stood there for a long moment, her grandmother's notebook clutched against her chest. Then she lit the burner. She didn't think about what she was doing. Not really. Didn't think about Madame Sio's warning, or the staff who might find her, or what it would mean if Haejun himself walked in. She thought only about the recipe in front of her, written in her grandmother's careful hand. Oh, simple pepper soup, the kind her grandmother used to make on cold nights. The kind that had once made Ada feel like nothing bad could happen to her, as long as that smell was in the house. She chopped Scotch bonnet peppers with hands that hadn't held a real knife in months. She found dried crayfish in a jar at the back of a shelf, clearly purchased once, by someone for some reason, and never used. She found ginger, garlic, a stock she made herself from bones the kitchen staff had thrown into a bin meant for waste. And slowly, in that tiny forgotten pantry, at 2 a.m, the smell of home began to fill the air. For the first time in a year, Ada felt like herself. She didn't hear the footsteps until they stopped, just behind her, in the doorway. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, like you're just going through the motions, waiting for something to change, take a second right now and just sit with this thought. Sometimes the smallest thing you do, the thing that feels like nothing, is the exact thing that changes everything. Keep that in your heart for the next few minutes. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit subscribe, because what happens next in this kitchen is going to change both of their lives forever. Ada turned, the wooden spoon still in her hand, and found herself face to face with Yoon Hae-jun for the first time since their wedding day. He looked different in the low light of the pantry than he had at the ceremony. Not because his face had changed, but because for the first time, she could see exhaustion etched into it. Dark circles under his eyes, a faint hollowness in his cheeks. He was wearing a loosened tie and a shirt that looked slept in, though she doubted he'd slept at all. He stared at her, then past her, at the small pot bubbling on the burner, then back at her. "What?" he said slowly, his voice rough from disuse. "Is that smell?" Ada's heart pounded. She had been told, in no uncertain terms, that this wing was forbidden to her. She braced herself for anger, for the cold dismissal she'd grown used to from this house. The kind that came not from shouting but from silence, from being made to disappear. Instead, Haejun took a step closer. His eyes, dark, sharp, the eyes of a man who noticed everything, moved from the pot to the open notebook on the counter, its pages stained with years of cooking, then back to Ada's face. "I asked you a question," he said, but there was something different in his tone now. Not quite gentle, but not cold either. Curious, despite himself. "It's pepper soup," Ada said, and to her own surprise, her voice didn't shake. "My grandmother's recipe, from Nigeria." "Why are you cooking in the staff pantry at 2 in the morning?" "Because I couldn't sleep," Ada said simply. "And because this is the only room in this entire house that has ever smelled like something was alive in it." She hadn't meant to say that last part. It slipped out, raw and unguarded, and she watched Haejun's face for the reaction, for the flicker of offense, the reminder of her place, the cold retreat she'd come to expect from every interaction in this house. Instead, he was quiet, his eyes moved to the pot again. The steam rising from it carried the scent of pepper and ginger, and something deep and earthy that he couldn't name. Something that pulled at a memory so old and so buried he'd forgotten it existed until this exact moment. He stopped, started again, and Ada thought for just a second that the most powerful man in Busan looked almost embarrassed. "Is there enough for 2? Ada blinked. Then, slowly, she reached for a second bowl from the shelf. She ladled the soup carefully, the way her grandmother had taught her. A little of everything, the broth and the meat and the bits of pepper that had softened into the stock, and handed it to him without a word. Haejun took it, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment, and Ada felt a strange jolt at the contact, like static electricity, like something waking up after a long sleep. He didn't sit. He stood there, in the doorway of a pantry that probably hadn't been used in years, and brought the bowl to his lips. The first sip seemed to still something in him. Ada watched his face change, watched the tightness around his eyes loosen, watched his shoulders, which she now realized had been hunched this entire time, drop slightly, as if some invisible weight had shifted. He didn't say anything. He took another sip, then another. And by the time he lowered the bowl, it was nearly empty, and his eyes, when they met hers, were different than they'd been a few minutes ago. "My mother used to make something like this," he said quietly. His voice had lost its edge entirely now, when I was very small. Before he stopped himself and Ada saw something flicker across his face, quick and painful, before he shut it away again. "It's been a long time since I tasted anything like that. I'm sorry," Ada said. And she meant it. For whatever loss had crossed his face just then, for whatever it was he'd cut himself off from saying. Haejun looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her the way no one in this house ever had, not as a transaction, not as an obligation, but as a person standing in front of him at 2 in the morning, holding a wooden spoon, with flour on her sleeve and steam curling around her face. "What's your name?" he asked. "Your real name, not the one on the marriage certificate." "Ida," she said. "Amara Adelaise, but everyone calls me Ada." "Ada," he repeated, like he was testing the shape of it in his mouth. "I'm Haejun, though I suppose you already knew that." It was such a small thing, an introduction, a name spoken aloud 11 months after their wedding, but it landed in Ada's chest like something enormous. For the first time since she'd arrived in this country, in this house, in this marriage, someone had asked her name like the answer actually mattered. "Thank you for the soup," Haejun said. He set the empty bowl down on the counter, carefully, like it was something fragile. Then, at the doorway, he paused and looked back at her. "Will you be here tomorrow night, at this time?" Ada hesitated. She thought about Madame Sio's warning. She thought about the staff who would surely report this to her if they found out. She thought about everything she stood to lose if this man, this cold, exhausted, powerful stranger she'd been married to for nearly a year, decided tomorrow that tonight had been a mistake, a momentary lapse, something to be forgotten. But she also thought about the way his shoulders had dropped, the way his eyes had changed, the way, for just a few minutes, the silence between them had felt less like a wall and more like a held breath. "Yes," she said, "I'll be here." Haejun nodded once, that same small, sharp nod from their wedding day, but this time it felt like something entirely different. Not dismissal, a promise. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the dark hallway, leaving Ada alone in the pantry with 2 empty bowls and a pot still warm on the burner, and a feeling in her chest she hadn't allowed herself to feel in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was called: hope. She didn't know it yet, But somewhere down the hall, behind a half-closed door, Madame Seo had been awake the entire time, and she had heard every word. Madame Seo stood very still in the shadows of her doorway long after Haejun's footsteps had faded down the hall, her hands folded in front of her face unreadable in the dark. 22 years, that was how long she had served this family. She had been there when Haejun's mother died, when his father hardened into the man who built the empire Haejun now carried on his shoulders. She had watched a small, grieving boy grow into a man who trusted no one, and she had made certain, every single day since, that nothing and no one got close enough to hurt him again. And now, in the space of one bowl of soup, a foreign girl from the slums of Lagos had undone something Madame Seo had spent 2 decades protecting. She turned and walked back into her room without a sound, already thinking. If you're watching this and you've ever had someone in your life who smiled at you while quietly working against you, someone whose loyalty looked like love but acted like control, take a breath right now. You're not imagining it. Trust your instincts. And if this story is starting to feel personal to you in any way, that's exactly why you need to stay until the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe, because what Madame Seo does next is going to test everything Ada has built. The midnight meetings became a quiet ritual. Every night, long after the house had gone still, Ada would slip down to the small pantry, and every night, Haejun would find his way there too. Sometimes within minutes, sometimes after an hour, as if he were testing whether she'd really be there, the way he tested everything in his life for weakness before he allowed himself to believe in it. She cooked for him. Not the elaborate sculptural dishes his former chefs had spent hours plating, but real food. Pepper soup, jollof rice made with rice she'd asked Sujin to smuggle from a small African grocery across the city, fried plantain that filled the pantry with a sweet, smoky smell. And every night Haejun ate like a man remembering, slowly, painfully, what it felt like to be hungry for something other than power. He started talking too. Not about the business. Never about the business, but about small things. The way Busan smelled after rain. A song his mother used to hum. The fact that he hadn't taken a single day off in 11 years. Because the moment he stopped moving, he said, he was afraid of what he might feel. You don't have to be afraid of feeling something, Ada told him one night, stirring a pot of stew. Feeling something doesn't make you weak. Pretending you don't is what makes you tired. Haejun had looked at her for a long time after that. You say things to me that no one else would dare say, he said quietly. Why aren't you afraid of me, Ada? Because I've already survived the worst thing that can happen to a person, she said. Watching the people you love give up. A man with money and guards is frightening to people who have something to lose. I don't have anything left to lose, Haejun. So you don't frighten me, you just seem lonely. He hadn't said anything to that. But the next night, he brought her a small gift, a proper chef's knife, the kind she hadn't held since she left Lagos, and set it on the counter without a word. Like, he was embarrassed by the gesture. Like he didn't quite know how to give something without expecting anything back. Ada had cried that night, after he left. Not from sadness, from the strange, overwhelming feeling of being seen, really seen, for the first time in over a year. But the warmth between them in the pantry stayed in the pantry. By day, the mansion was the same cold, silent place it had always been. Haejun didn't acknowledge her in front of the staff. Madame Seo's hostility, if anything, sharpened. Small things began to go wrong. Ada's grandmother's notebook went missing for 2 days before turning up exactly where she'd left it. Pages slightly out of order, as if someone had gone through it. Sujin was reassigned to a different wing of the house with no explanation, and a new, older maid took her place, one who watched Ada's every move and reported. Ada was certain, everything she saw. Ada said nothing. She told herself it didn't matter, as long as the nights were hers. As long as, for an hour after midnight, she had a place in this house that felt like it was actually hers. She didn't yet understand how dangerous that hour would become. The dinner with the heads of the rival families had been planned for months, a delicate negotiation over shipping routes and territory lines that, depending on how it went, could either secure years of peace between the Yoon organization and its rivals, or ignite a war that would spill blood across half the city. Haejun had not mentioned it to Ada. Why would he? Business was business, and whatever was growing between them in the quiet hours of the night had never once crossed into daylight. So Ada was surprised, and immediately wary, when Madame Seo appeared at her door that afternoon, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes, holding a garment bag. Master Yoon requests your presence at tonight's dinner, Madame Seo said smoothly. As his wife, it's customary for you to greet the guests. I've brought something appropriate for you to wear. Ada's instinct screamed that something was wrong. In 11 months, she had never once been included in anything related to Haejun's world. Not a dinner, not an event, not even a photograph. And now, suddenly, on the night of the most important negotiation of the year, she was being summoned. But she also thought of Haejun, exhausted, guarded Haejun, who had let her in an inch at a time over the past weeks. And some part of her wanted badly to be there for him, to stand beside him even silently, even just once. She should have trusted her instincts. The dress Madame Seo brought was beautiful and deliberately, unmistakably wrong. It was a pale, delicate thing, the kind of dress meant for a garden party, not a room full of armed men negotiating territory. Ada knew, the moment she put it on, that she would look exactly like what these men expected a foreign bride to look like: decorative, foolish, out of place. She thought about refusing, about changing into something of her own. But she also knew that refusing Madame Seo's instructions, framed as they were as Master Yoon's request, might cause more trouble than it solved, and besides, some quiet, stubborn part of her wanted to see, for herself, what kind of man Haejun was in the world he actually ruled. The dining hall, when she entered it on Madame Seo's arm, was exactly as intimidating as she'd feared: long, dark, lit by low gold light, filled with men in expensive suits who carried themselves like loaded weapons. At the head of the table sat Haejun, and the moment his eyes found Ada, standing awkwardly in a doorway in a dress that screamed out of place, something in his expression went very still. It wasn't anger, it was confusion, and then fast on its heels, a flicker of something like alarm. He hadn't requested this. Ada saw it in his face immediately. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't his doing, but it was too late. One of the rival bosses, a broad-shouldered man with cold eyes named Director Lim, head of a rival syndicate that had been pushing against Yoon territory for years, had already noticed her. "Ah," Lim said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, a slow, mocking smile spreading across his face. "I'd heard rumors that the great Yoon Haejun had taken a foreign bride. I assumed it was a joke." He looked Ada up and down, taking in the ill-fitting dress, the way she stood frozen in the doorway. "Tell me, Haejun, is this some kind of charity project? Or did you lose a bet?" A ripple of low laughter moved around the table. Ada felt her face grow hot, felt the old, familiar sensation of being looked at and seen as less worthy, less real, a curiosity rather than a person. Haejun's hand, resting on the table, curled slowly into a fist. "Choose your next words carefully, Lim," he said, and his voice had dropped into the low, dangerous register Ada had heard described by the staff but never witnessed herself. The voice of the man this whole city was afraid of. But Lim, emboldened by the laughter of the others, leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. "Or what? You'll have your wife serve us tea?" He smirked. "Honestly, Haejun, I always thought you had taste. This is almost insulting." The room held its breath, waiting for the explosion everyone expected, for guns, for shouting, for the kind of violence these men understood as the language of respect. Instead, Ada took a step forward. Every eye in the room turned to her. Haejun's jaw tightened, and she saw, just for a moment, real fear in his eyes. Not for himself, but for her, in a room full of men who could end a life with a single word. But Ada didn't feel afraid. Not anymore. Because she realized, standing there in that ridiculous dress, surrounded by men who saw her as nothing, that she had spent her entire life being underestimated. And every single time, it had been the moment right before she proved them wrong. "Director Lim," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tense silence of the room. "I understand you've come a long way for this dinner, and I understand you have strong opinions about what belongs at this table and what doesn't." Lim raised an eyebrow, amused. "Go on. So let me ask you something," Ada continued, walking slowly toward the long table. Every step measured, every eye in the room following her. "When was the last time you ate a meal that you actually enjoyed? Not a meal that impressed someone. Not a meal that cost more than most people's homes. A meal that made you feel something." The room was utterly silent now. Even Lim's smirk had faltered slightly, thrown off by the question. "Because I think," Ada went on, stopping just behind an empty chair at the table, "that men who have everything money can buy often forget what it feels like to be fed. And I think that's a much bigger problem than what I'm wearing." She turned to Haejun and for the first time all night allowed herself to look directly at him. Not as his wife in front of his enemies, but as the person who had shared a pot of soup with him at 2 a.m. for the past 3 weeks. "With your permission," she said quietly, "I'd like to cook for your guests tonight. Please, if you have gotten this far, comment where you're watching this from and subscribe to support the channel." For one long suspended moment, no one in the dining hall moved. Then Haejun rose to his feet, slowly, deliberately, every man at the table watching him for a cue on how to react. He looked at Ada, standing there in her ill-fitting dress with her chin lifted, and her eyes steady. And something in his expression shifted from alarm to something Ada had only seen once before, in the dim light of a forgotten pantry. "My wife," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent room, "has spent the last several weeks reminding me what it means to actually taste food, instead of simply consuming it." He turned to Director Lim, and his tone hardened into something with an edge of steel beneath the politeness. "I think you should take her up on the offer, Lim. I'd hate for you to leave my home tonight, having missed the only good thing it has to offer." It wasn't quite in order. But in a room like this, it didn't need to be. If you've ever had a moment where you stopped shrinking yourself to fit into a room that didn't want you, where you stood up straight and let people see exactly who you are, consequences be damned. This next part is for you. Take a breath. Whatever room you're walking into this week, walk in like Ada. And if you're still with me, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens in this kitchen is the moment everything changes. Ada didn't wait for anyone to object. She turned and walked toward the kitchen with the same steady steps she'd used to cross the dining hall, and behind her, she heard the scrape of chairs, the murmur of conversation resuming, tense but no longer hostile. 16 powerful men suddenly very curious about what was about to happen. The kitchen staff froze when she walked in. The head chef, a stiff, formal man who had clearly never once been overruled in his own kitchen, opened his mouth to object, but one look at Ada's face made him close it again. "I need your stove," Ada said. "And whatever peppers, ginger, and good stock you have. I don't need anything imported. I need anything that's actually alive." What she made that night wasn't elegant. It wasn't plated with gold leaf or served on imported porcelain. It was a rich, dark stew, her grandmother's recipe again, the same one that had broken through to Haejun weeks ago, served simply in deep bowls with rice on the side and nothing else. When it was carried out to the dining hall, Director Lim looked at the bowl in front of him with open disdain. "This is what you interrupted my dinner for," he said, loud enough for the table to hear. "Some kind of peasant stew? Try it," Ada said simply. "Or don't. But I think everyone at this table is curious now, and you'll look strange if you're the only one who's too afraid to find out." A few of the other bosses, intrigued despite themselves, had already picked up their spoons. Lim, very aware of the eyes on him, scowled and took a single, grudging bite, clearly intending to make some dismissive comment and move on. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Ada watched his face the way she'd watched Haejun's weeks ago, watched the same surprise, the same unexpected softening, ripple across features that had spent decades hardening into something cold. Around the table, the other men were having similar reactions. Quiet exclamations, second and third bites, a few of them actually laughing in surprised pleasure. "What is this?" one of the older bosses asked, looking at Ada with something like wonder. "Home," Ada said simply. "Wherever that is for each of you. I imagine it's been a long time since any of you tasted it." By the end of the meal, the tone in the room had shifted entirely. The negotiation that followed, Ada wasn't part of it, of course. She retreated quietly once the food had done its work. Went better than anyone, including Haejun, had expected. Territory lines were agreed upon without a single threat being exchanged. Even Director Lim, on his way out, paused at the door and looked back at Ada with something that wasn't quite respect, but wasn't far from it either. "Your wife," he told Haejun, "is the most dangerous weapon you've ever had in this house. Treat her accordingly." He had no idea how right he was, or how close Ada had already come to being driven out of that house entirely. Madame Seo watched the night's events unfold from the shadows of the hallway, her expression carefully neutral. But inside, something had hardened into resolve. The girl wasn't a passing distraction anymore. She had just done in one evening what Madame Seo had spent years training Haejun to never allow. She had made him vulnerable in front of his enemies, made him show weakness, made him show that there was something, someone, he cared about enough to defend. To Madame Seo, that wasn't romance. That was a liability with a target on its back. So over the following weeks, she began, carefully and patiently, to plant seeds. It started small. A comment here, dropped casually in front of Haejun while he reviewed reports. "I heard the new chef's family back in Lagos has been receiving rather generous transfers lately. Strange, isn't it, how quickly word travels about a woman who married into money?" It wasn't true. Ada had sent nothing home, had in fact refused every offer Haejun had made to support her parents, telling him she needed to find her own way first, that she didn't want money to be the only thing that ever passed between her and this marriage. But Madame Seo didn't need it to be true. She only needed it to be possible. A single thread of doubt, woven carefully into the mind of a man who had spent his entire life believing that everyone eventually wanted something from him. Next came the documents. Bank records, doctored just enough, left where Hae-jun would find them. A photograph of Ada's father, looking prosperous in a way he hadn't been in years, with a note in Madame Seo's careful handwriting. Found this in her room. Thought you should know before it goes any further. Hae-jun didn't confront Ada. That was the cruelest part. He simply pulled away. The midnight visits to the pantry stopped. One night, then another, then a week of nights. When Ada passed him in the hallways, his eyes slid past her like she was a stranger again. Like the past month had never happened. Ada didn't understand it. She replayed every conversation, every moment, searching for what she'd done wrong. She told herself it didn't matter, that she'd known going in what kind of marriage this was. She told herself the warmth she'd felt in that pantry had probably meant more to her than it ever had to him. But it hurt. It hurt in a way she hadn't expected, because somewhere along the way, without meaning to, she had started to hope for something real. After 2 weeks of silence, Ada packed her suitcase. Which brings us back to where we started. Ada, standing at the front door of the Yoon mansion, hand on the cold brass handle, ready to walk away from a marriage that had given her, for one brief month, the only real connection she'd felt since leaving home. She had left a note. Not for Hae-jun, she didn't think he'd care enough to read it, but for Soo-jin, the only person in this house who had ever shown her real kindness. Thank you for everything. I hope you find your way to somewhere warm. The door was heavy under her hand. She pulled it open, and the cold night air rushed in. And for one moment, Ada let herself feel the full weight of everything she was leaving behind. Not the house, not the money, but the man who had eaten her soup at 2 in the morning and told her, for the first time in his life, that he felt full. She stepped through the door and nearly collided with Hae-jun, who was coming up the front steps at exactly that moment, his coat still on, having just returned from a meeting that had run far longer than expected. He stopped dead. His eyes went from her face to the suitcase in her hand, and Ada watched something break open in his expression. Shock, then confusion, then a dawning, desperate understanding. Ada, his voice cracked slightly on her name. Where are you going? Home, Ada said quietly. Wherever that is. I haven't figured that part out yet. Why? The word came out raw, stripped of every ounce of the cold control he usually wore like armor. Ada, why now? What happened? You happened, Hae-jun, she said, and her voice shook despite herself. For a month, you let me believe. I let myself believe that I mattered to you as something more than a chef, more than an arrangement. And then you just stopped. No explanation, no goodbye. Just silence like before. I can survive a marriage with no affection, Hae-jun. I did it for 11 months. But I can't survive a marriage that gave me a taste of something real and then took it away without a word. Hae-jun stood there, in the cold, staring at her, and then, for the first time since she'd known him, his composure shattered completely. Madame Seo showed me documents, he said. The words tumbling out, raw and unsteady. Records. Transfers to your family, photographs of your father living well. She said you'd. He stopped, shaking his head, as if even saying it now disgusted him. She said you were only ever after the money. And God, Ada, I believed her. Not because I wanted to. Because it's the only story I've ever known. Everyone wants something. That's the rule I've lived by my entire life. And I was so afraid that you were the same, that if I let myself believe otherwise, and I was wrong. I never asked you for anything, Ada said quietly. I never wanted anything from you except an hour of your time after midnight in a kitchen that finally felt alive. I know, Hae-jun said, and his voice broke completely now. I know that. I knew it the moment I saw your suitcase. Ada, please, don't go. Not because of some debt, not because of the marriage on paper. Because for the first time in my entire life, someone looked at me and saw a person instead of a name on a door. And I don't know how to go back to being just a name again. The front hall light spilled out onto the steps where they stood, and somewhere behind them, in the shadows of the doorway, Madame Seo watched silently. And for the first time in 22 years of careful control, she understood that she had lost. Ada looked at the suitcase in her hand, then at the man in front of her, not the cold, untouchable boss the city feared, but someone standing in the night air, with his heart laid bare for the first time in his life, terrified of losing the one person who had ever made him feel whole. She set the suitcase down. If I stay, she said softly, Madame Seo goes. And I want the truth, Hae-jun, all of it, every time, even when it's hard. I've spent my whole life being lied to by people who decided I couldn't handle the truth. I won't live like that again. Done, Hae-jun said, without a moment's hesitation, both of those things. Done. A year later, on a quiet street in Busan, a small restaurant opened its doors for the first time. It wasn't grand or imposing, just warm light spilling through wide windows, the smell of pepper soup and fresh rice drifting onto the street, and a simple sign above the door that read, in both Korean and English, The quiet hour. Inside, Ada moved through the kitchen with the same quiet confidence she'd always had, while Haejun, no longer the man the city whispered about in fear, but a man slowly, deliberately building something honest, greeted guests at the door, his eyes finding hers across the room every few minutes, like he still couldn't quite believe she was real. And every night, after the last guest had gone, the two of them would sit together at a small table near the kitchen, sharing one bowl between them, the same recipe that had started it all, and talk, just talk about nothing and everything. The way they had once done at 2 in the morning in a forgotten pantry, when a lonely man and an overlooked woman found in each other the one thing neither of them had ever been able to buy: home.